Hi, and welcome back to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. We are sitting out here in Raymond Park in Cambridge, Massachusetts right now, and today's guest is Jim Stockard, one of the great people that I've known in my world in urban planning, who is a professor at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. He has been on the Affordable Housing Trust and is still on that board, and served on the board of the Cambridge Housing Authority for many, many years. And we're going to dig into all the subjects around housing, around public housing, and the issues we're facing. So Jim, welcome to Unplanned.
Thank you very much, Sam.
Now, Jim, you were telling me a little bit about Raymond Park just before we started, which is that your son's Little League career actually started here.
I was playing catch with him over there. He was about 5, and a guy named Rocky came by, kind of a crotchety old guy, and he looked at Aaron throwing the ball to me and said, "I'm going to draft that boy for my minor league team." So he did. In fact, Aaron learned his skills from Rocky and a few other people. Went on to be the starting shortstop for the Cambridge Region Latin Falcons for 3 years when he was up there. And at the age of 50, is still playing shortstop for his LA rec team out in Los Angeles. So this was a very important place for him to be found.
And that's a whole other story. We'll talk about public parks in another episode of Unplanned. But I'm guessing that when your son was starting out his Little League career, these buildings behind us didn't exist yet. Is that fair
Not
to say?
those particular buildings.
Right.
There was a public housing site there.
Right.
With a very different set of buildings.
Right.
Rather nice little buildings, little small one-story row house kind of things. The problem was they were built in a floodplain.
Right.
They began to get very wet basements that the Housing Authority had a very hard time preserving a healthy environment in those homes. And so eventually, not too short for their lifespan, but at about the age of 50, we tore them down and built these buildings here, which I think are much nicer and certainly much more contemporary.
Yeah, and what we're talking about is these buildings right behind us here. And that gets us into your world in public housing, which is a whole aspect of housing. Housing is something you've spent basically your career thinking about and working on.
Yep, that's right.
But let's start the conversation talking about public housing, which is one of the sectors that honestly doesn't get as much attention, I don't think, as some of the other aspects of housing.
Yeah, public housing is our, if you will, our second foray into housing as a matter of public discussion. The first really is the 1913 Federal Income Tax Act, because in the very first act we created the mortgage interest deduction. Right. Which subsidizes homeowners, sort of upper income homeowners. That was sort of our first statement that housing is important enough to be a public matter. Right. And then with the Public Housing Act in 1937, we decided, you know what, we ought to get more involved. We ought to construct some housing. We ought to make some housing available to people of modest means. And so it is in a sense, our second oldest, and in terms of physical structures, our oldest public intervention into the housing world.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. I mean, let's just spend a second on that. So 1913, the income tax is coming in, and housing is one of the ways to invest in the populace as a whole. And then as we get into the 30s, what's the sort of general atmosphere of what's going on there, and what were some of the impetuses to decide we'd actually get into bricks and mortar and building things?
We're between the two wars. We've been through a couple of downturns in the economy. There are a wide range of people, including people who might have been in the middle class, but for those events. They went off to war, and the young men hadn't gotten their college when they might have. We had a depression, and people lost all their resources, and people who might have been in the middle class were not. And they were having trouble affording housing. And so there became a movement spurred by women, and interestingly, Catherine Bauer Worcester and Edith Wood. Catherine Bauer Worcester had been to Europe and seen the social housing in Europe, and was very attractive. Low-rise, brick, sort of courtyards, and moms with their strollers and their kids in the sandbox. And she came back with this very idyllic picture of what social housing could be like, and had a big influence on Franklin Roosevelt and his wife, and became a major author of the 1937 Housing Act, which got some things quite correct and made some very fundamental mistakes.
Well, we're going to dig into both of those right now, but tell me if this is correct. Some of the first bricks and mortar public housing is right here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Is that correct?
There are approximately 6 developments in this country, public housing sites, that claim to be the first public housing ever built. There's one in Atlanta, there's one in New York, there's one in here in Cambridge. Washington Elms and Newtown Court, particularly Washington Newtown Court, was built actually in 1935 under the Works Progress Administration, WPA. And later, when the 37 Act passed and we created a housing authority in Cambridge, they acquired Newtown Court from the city proper, and it turned over to the housing authority and became public housing, even though it actually predates the Housing Act itself.
Oh, that's fascinating. Now let's get into we're going to spend a little more time in history, and then we'll get more into the modern day,
Sure.
present day issues. But tell us a little bit about what they got right and what they maybe didn't get quite as right in 1937.
Well,
And also what the knock-on effects have been of those two facts.
Sure. Well, the thing they got right, the biggest thing they got right was public housing, the social housing program in this country should be administered by local agencies. It should be sensitive to local needs in terms of location and priorities for admission and things like that. But the money should come from the feds because the local governments just couldn't collect enough money to do that. So the initial formula was the feds will give you the money to build the building, so you have no debt, no mortgage. And then that means that the rents only have to cover the operating costs. Utilities, no taxes in most communities, including ours. Maintenance, those kinds of activities. And so rents will take care of that. And we don't have to have rents that are up here in order to pay the mortgage, right? So in the early days of public housing, well, let me go on and talk about some other things they got right and things they didn't get right. They got right the idea that the city should approve the applications they made to the federal government. You won't let the housing authority just go off and do entirely its own thing. So they try to integrate the city and the housing authority. On the other hand, they liked the idea of a housing authority being a separate, independent public agency. They didn't like Tammany Hall in New York, where administration and politics are all wrapped up in one. And they thought that if they made this a separate public body with board members appointed by the chief executive, right? That then it could run its own operation. It wouldn't be messed around with by all those ugly politicians. It's not that simple, Sam, and it's not the way it's worked over the years, but that was the theory in the beginning.
Let me pause you just for a second there. So are all public housing entities have an authority that manages, runs, et cetera, or are there any exceptions to that?
There are no exceptions to that.
So every public housing is...
They're known as PHAs in the legislation, public housing authorities. Each state defines them in their own way. So in Massachusetts, there are 4 members appointed by the chief executive officer of the local community. In the cities, and 1 appointed by the governor. In smaller towns, you actually run for office. Again, 4 people who run for office and 1 appointed by the governor. They're appointed by the governor in a state because we have a state public housing program that's parallel to our federal program. We're one of only 3 states in the nation with a state-funded public housing program. In some states, there's 7 board members, and 1's appointed by the local judge or some lawyer somewhere. You're always public officials that appoint the members of the authority, but they are differently constructed in each state, but they are the same format, that is a board which then hires a staff to run the operation.
And who gets a housing authority? I mean, let's say the state of Massachusetts, some communities have them, some communities don't. Some are obvious, Boston, Cambridge, but some are less obvious.
Right.
And how does that all get?
Well, the interesting part of that, I'm not a lawyer, Sam, as you well know, but the act itself says there is hereby created in every city and town in the country a local housing authority.
Oh, interesting.
And in order for that housing authority to be put to work, the state must first define what a housing authority is in their state, right? So the first act is the state legislature. In our state, it's 5 board members, yada, yada, yada. In some other state, it's some other number. Every state in the country has done that part of the work. And then what's required is for the local board to get to work. The city manager appoints 4 people, the governor appoints 4 people, and then once you got a body of people, then they can apply to the federal government for funding. to be able to build things.
I see.
And so
there has to be a will and a desire at the local level to
Exactly.
say, we're actually going to go down this, we're going to build some of this stuff.
Exactly.
We have to create this entity to...
In Massachusetts, there are 250 housing authorities.
Really?
So that means there's 100 cities and towns that have not chosen to have any public housing in their town.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
And they could start it tomorrow if they wanted to, just there's no federal money involved anymore. So.
Oh, well, let's finish out on what they got right and what they got wrong. And we were at Tammany Hall and the desire to sort of separate out. You were sort of running through some of those. Are there any other sort of yeses and nos you want to point out of what they did well in 1937 or not?
Yeah, the biggest thing they got wrong
Right.
was that nobody who was involved in that legislation knew anything about real estate.
Right.
So, for example, it is not legal for a housing authority to have a line in their budget that says capital reserve. Now, Sam, I have not been to your house,
Right.
but I know this about your house.
Right.
Your roof will wear out one day.
Right.
You
Yes.
will have to replace your boiler.
Yes.
And you don't have to tell me whether that's today or 5
Right,
years ago. You just
right.
did it, but they will wear out.
Right.
And so the traditional way that a multifamily property owner takes care of that is each year they have a budget for taxes and a budget for maintenance and a budget for utilities, and they have a budget that's called capital reserve. And they put a certain money, if you will, in the bank.
Yeah.
And they save it. They save it for years and years, and then suddenly their roof wears out, and they've got this savings account they can tap to pay for the roof. They don't have to jack up the rents on everybody to pay for the roof or dip into their own pockets. Housing authorities have never been allowed to have a capital reserve, and that there isn't anybody who's been in real estate for a month that doesn't know that capital reserves are a really important part of your budgeting. Right. And so what that means is, after a number of years, it was actually from 1937 to 1961 before HUD finally caught up with this fact.
Oh, really?
Because the housing authorities, anything that had worn out before then, they kind of patched together their operating budget and took a little money from here, a little money from there, and managed to fix the roof. But they were beginning to complain to HUD that we got roofs are going and kitchens are terrible and we got to replace our boilers and so HUD finally decided they would create a fund called modernization money, and the housing authorities would come to them and say, "We got a roof problem. Give us some money for the roof."
Interesting.
So that I'll tell you some more about that in a minute, depending on how long you've got, Sam.
Well, that's always a question with unplanned: is how much information do we pack into these conversations? But yeah,
let me tell you one more thing about the budgeting process. Housing authorities have never been allowed to borrow any money. Now remember, they have 100% equity in their buildings. They have no mortgage. So there's a huge amount of equity, billions of dollars of equity across this country. No housing authority is allowed to take a loan. Again, crazy.
Yeah.
That's a really fundamental way to handle the capital needs is, we got a lot of capital needs, our bank account isn't big enough, we'll borrow some money and fix the roof. And in the conventional sense, we'll raise the rents a little bit in order to cover the debt service on the loan. Well, it would have been easy for the federal government to say, if you can't have a capital reserve, then when you do have a problem, borrow some money, tell us how much the new, and we'll give you an extra amount of subsidy every year to do that. They didn't do that. The third financial problem is that that original idea that rents would cover operating costs failed pretty quickly.
Right.
Because guess why? Costs went up faster than incomes did. So when your costs are higher than your incomes, then there are several answers. Raise the rents. Well, that's not the idea of public housing. We're not going to raise rent. Well, get richer tenants. No, that's not the idea.
Right.
Well, the other option, let's not do the maintenance.
Right.
And so therefore, many public housing sites in this country that are in difficult shape, capital-wise, are in that shape precisely because the federal government has never understood real estate.
Interesting. Now, just on that, is it that they don't understand? It sounds like they were suspicious of local authorities and what they might do if they could borrow money or if they could sort of amass a capital fund or something like that. Would be my guess as to what some of the thinking was.
I suspect that there were some folks in the federal government who had that feeling, that set of feelings. I hesitate to be bold about this, but
sure.
There certainly were discussions about the quality of public housing. Right. This is housing for after the first blush, when it was really, you can look at some pictures of the waiting lines for the first public housing in Cambridge. Folks in mink coats arriving in nice cars, because remember, they were the displaced middle class at that point. And so after a while, that changed, and it became to be more of a program for people of modest means. And I confess that I imagine there were some people in the federal government who thought, well, it's just poor people. We don't have to build that nice a thing for them.
Right.
And if they have to wait an extra year and patch the roofs a little bit instead of replacing it, they're just poor people. There are other options, not much better. So this is pretty good stuff. A variety of prejudices kept the federal government, kept the U.S. Congress particularly, from ever funding this program at an adequate level.
Interesting.
The other piece of the financial difficulty was, as those costs went up faster than incomes went up, it took till about 61 for the feds to decide they needed to provide an operating subsidy in addition to the first capital. So now we say, all right, we'll build the buildings free for you, you got no mortgage, but your costs are going up, maintenance is more expensive, utilities more expensive, insurance more expensive. Therefore, if we're gonna hold on to serving poor people, we're going to have to give you an operating subsidy on top of what the residents pay.
Right.
And that's always been inadequate.
Yes. So now let's jump ahead to your life in public housing. So that's getting us into sort of the modern day. What have you seen and experienced in your various roles as it relates to public housing about what works now? You said, I think, in what you were just saying, that the federal government now provides no money. Is that true?
No, not no money. Well, there's no money for new buildings.
Oh, okay.
You can't build any new public housing these days, unless you're one of a handful of housing authorities in America that figured out how to do it.
Okay.
But what we have now is the federal government gives housing authorities money in 3 spigots. One spigot is this so-called modernization money, right? Fix the roof, do a new kitchen. They give us roughly every year 10% of what we need to fix everything that's wrong. Oh, and by the way, the needs grow by about 10% every year. Somebody's roof goes bad now that wasn't bad last year. So basically, when we get that money from the modernization fund, we're fixing things we should have fixed 10 years ago. And therefore, when residents complain about the condition of their homes, it's not the housing authority's fault. I mean, it might be. They might be very bad administrators, but as a general rule, it's the fault of the Congress and the federal government. The second spigot is operating capital, operating funds, to go on top of what the residents pay to be able to cover the full cost of operating. These days, the federal government, Congress gives us about 82% of what the formula says we should get. There is a formula for how it is, how much money a housing authority needs, depends on the housing stock they have, how old it is, and elevators and things like that. But the federal government gives us 82% of what their own formula says we're entitled to.
From them.
From them.
So they say we should be giving you $1. We're giving you 82 cents
exactly
instead.
Right. Exactly right.
Okay.
And the third spigot is the Section 8 leased housing funds. You may know those about vouchers, where people get money from the housing authority to go and shop for a home anywhere they want to, including anywhere in or out of Cambridge. You can take a voucher from the Cambridge Housing Authority and go to Nebraska if you want to do that. So there are those 3 spigots. They are not allowed to be mixed, which is for most housing authorities. It's a shame. It's another element of the federal government not trusting the local housing authority.
Right.
Places like Cambridge.
I would think operating and modernization might have an overlap there. There might be some.
Well, they absolutely do. If you've got crappy windows that are leaking all the time, and you replace them, you spend some money to replace them with triple glazed windows, your electric bill will go down through the floor. So one might think, again, it's that problem of not understanding real estate really well. And Sam, I've always maintained there are many people who go to work for housing authorities and to serve people, and if you will, they have a calling, they have a mission for why they're doing that work.
And it's that kind of work. Housing in general is sort of that kind of work, but I would imagine housing authorities even more so.
And what I need to say to those people is, if you can't do the real estate, then you don't get to do the mission. If you're running housing that leaks, if you're running housing that's not safe, if you're running housing with unpleasant people in it that are doing illegal things, if you're running housing that you can't keep warm enough, then your opportunity to provide resident services and help people take the next step in their lives is really compromised.
Right.
So we got to get the real estate right.
Right.
And it's not that hard, frankly. It's pretty fundamental, and there are millions of people around who understand how to do that.
Yeah.
And there's a handful of housing authorities, including ours here in Cambridge, that have collected some of those people and do a superb job
Right.
of providing nice homes for people of modest means.
But is the if part of that job is banging your head against a brick wall, is the brick wall the United States Congress, HUD? I mean, is it just that you can't change the system enough to make it flexible enough to address some of these issues in real time in ways that a private developer might address them?
There's a handful of housing authorities in America that are in a program called Moving to Work. It has nothing to do with work.
Right.
It's an old program that got manipulated around. And those housing authorities have permission to be much more flexible, exchange those funds from those 3 different spigots, find some money someplace else. So what I would say about the brick wall, yes, the brick wall is the US Congress, and to some extent HUD itself. But the really good housing authorities, these 30 moving to work housing authorities, find ways to go around the wall, over the wall, under the wall. They just refuse to let the wall stop them because they're committed to the service of the people that they're trying to take care of.
Well, yeah. So what is the? You mentioned the mission of housing authorities. What is the mission of housing authorities? I mean, in today's world, because it often gets used as a political football for a lot of different reasons.
Right.
And some of them really unpleasant reasons. But what are housing authorities trying to accomplish?
The mission of public housing is to provide affordable homes, and by affordable we mean 30% of income, should be less actually, but 30% or less, for people of modest means for the longest period of time possible and the most number of homes possible. It's just as straightforward as that. Build more homes, serve more people, get the cost as low as you can, in order to make it Sam, housing is fundamental. You look at Maslow's little pyramid, it's on the very bottom, if you will. And if you or your viewers haven't looked at Matt Desmond's book called Eviction.
Okay, I don't know it.
It is
Matt Desmond, Eviction.
Desmond, Eviction. He's got a brand new book called Poverty, but this book about 5-6 years ago is about people who have uncertain housing. They're not sure if they can pay the rent this next month. They are living in their car for a little while. The average homeless or near homeless child moves 3 times a month. That's 3 different schools, 3 different teachers, 3 different efforts to make friends. What are the chances that child's going to thrive one day and be a contributing member of our society? So I really do believe that, and I regard a stable home that's affordable as a launching pad for families. If you're worried about paying the rent this month, if you're worried about fixing the roof when the landlord won't do it, if you're worried about where you're going to find a house as you move for a new job, that's going to consume a huge amount of your energy, which means that the next step in your life, whether it's a job training program or more schooling or some counseling for your family or the opportunity to start a craft business or whatever it might be, you don't have time for that. And I want people to have time to explore those parts of their lives. So I think of a good, stable home as, among other things, a launching pad for the next part of your life, because those problems are not on your agenda every day.
Well, that's what we're going to be talking about the next time we get Jim back on Unplanned, so I'm looking forward to that.
That'll be fun, Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much.
Sure thing. Happy to be here.